On a cold September night in 1925, a middle-aged man stepped across the border from Finland into the Soviet Union. He carried a false passport, a pocket full of cyanide pills, and absolute confidence that he was about to alter the course of human history. His name was Sidney Riley, known to British intelligence as the Ace of Spies. Riley believed he was arriving to meet the core leadership of an underground counter-revolution. Instead, he was walking straight into a cage meticulously designed by the Soviet secret police. What Riley called the Monarchist Union of Central Russia was known inside the halls of Moscow's Lubyanka building by a far simpler code name: the Trust. It was not a resistance movement. It was a phantom, an elaborate political illusion conceived by Felix Dzerzhinsky, the ruthless founder of the Cheka, and masterminded by his brilliant head of counterintelligence, Artur Arduzov. For 4 years, Western intelligence agencies had been pouring money, equipment, and agents into this phantom network, believing they were funding the internal collapse of the Bolshevik regime. They thought they were backing a shadow government capable of mobilizing hundreds of thousands of disaffected citizens, military officers, and former Tsarist officials. In reality, every meeting Riley attended, every message he received, and every contact he made had been orchestrated by the Ogpu, the successor to the Cheka. To understand how a man as calculating as Sidney Riley could be so utterly deceived, one has to look at the psychological mechanics behind Operation Trust. Arduzov understood a fundamental truth about human nature and intelligence work. The most effective lie is one that tells the mark precisely what they desperately want to hear. The Western powers, specifically Britain, France, and Poland, were terrified of Bolshevik expansion, but exhausted by the trauma of World War I. They lacked the political will for another fool. The Western powers, still reeling from the devastation of World War I, were in no position to confront the Bolsheviks head-on, and this vulnerability created a fertile ground for Arduzov's masterplan. Operation Trust was designed to exploit this fear, to make the West believe that a powerful anti-Bolshevik movement was rising within the Soviet Union, one that could potentially topple the communist regime from within. This illusion was carefully crafted to appeal to the Western desire for a weakened Soviet Union, a desire so strong that it blinded them to the reality of the situation. The KGB, through Operation Trust, began feeding the West carefully selected pieces of information, hints of a growing internal resistance that could be supported and nurtured into a full-blown revolution. But that wasn't the only layer to Operation Trust. As the West began to take the bait, the KGB introduced another element to the operation: the creation of fake anti-Soviet organizations within the Soviet Union. These groups, completely under KGB control, would send out signals of dissent, making it seem as though a significant portion of the Soviet population was turning against the Bolsheviks. This was a bold move, as it required the KGB to walk a fine line between convincing the West of the existence of these groups and not arousing the suspicion of the Soviet population itself. The stakes were high. If discovered, the entire operation could collapse, exposing the KGB's manipulation and potentially leading to a severe deterioration in relations between the Soviet Union and the West. The complexity of Operation Trust deepened as it progressed, with the KGB utilizing multiple channels to disseminate their fabricated intelligence. They exploited the existing networks of white Russian immigrants, many of whom were already in contact with Western intelligence agencies, feeding them stories of a growing resistance movement within the Soviet Union. These stories, often based on grains of truth but heavily embellished, were designed to resonate with the deep-seated hopes of the Western powers, that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse from within. However, the KGB's strategy was not without its risks. The more they wove their web of deceit, the greater the chance that inconsistencies would arise, threatening to unravel the entire operation. But Arduzov and his team were meticulous, anticipating potential pitfalls and adapting their strategy accordingly. As Operation Trust gained momentum, it began to influence Western policy towards the Soviet Union. The illusion of an imminent Bolshevik collapse led to a series of miscalculations by the West, including underestimating the Soviet Union's military capabilities and overestimating the strength of the internal opposition. This misjudgment had significant implications, as it led to a period of hesitation in forming a unified front against the Soviet Union, allowing the Bolsheviks to consolidate their power both domestically and internationally. But that wasn't the strangest part. Despite the elaborate nature of Operation Trust, there were moments when the line between reality and fiction became blurred, even for the KGB. Agents working on the operation sometimes found themselves questioning what was real and what was part of the charade, a testament to the operation's complexity and the psychological toll it took on those involved. The psychological aspect of Operation Trust was perhaps its most intriguing element. By creating an illusion of hope, the KGB played on the deepest desires of their adversaries, exploiting their willingness to believe in a narrative that promised a weakening of the Soviet Union. This psychological manipulation was not limited to the West. It also affected the Soviet population. The KGB's control over the narrative meant that they could dictate the perception of reality, both within and outside the Soviet Union. But as the operation progressed, the challenge of maintaining this illusion grew. The West, though initially deceived, began to show signs of skepticism, and the KGB had to innovate, introducing new layers to the operation to keep the illusion alive. This cat-and-mouse game between the KGB and Western intelligence agencies would become a defining feature of the Cold War, with Operation Trust serving as a precursor to the complex espionage battles that would follow. The operation's success can be measured by the extent to which it influenced Western policy and perception of the Soviet Union during the 1920s and early 1930s. The West's belief in an imminent Soviet collapse led to a lack of cohesion in their approach to dealing with the Bolsheviks, allowing the Soviet Union to navigate the early years of its existence with a degree of freedom it might not have otherwise enjoyed. However, as the years passed and the Soviet Union consolidated its power, the West began to realize its mistake. The awakening to the reality of Operation Trust was gradual, marked by a growing distrust of intelligence coming from Soviet émigré groups and a reevaluation of the Soviet Union's internal stability. But by then, the damage had been done. The Soviet Union had bought itself crucial time, and the stage was set for the geopolitical tensions that would define the Cold War. The aftermath of Operation Trust saw a significant shift in how Western intelligence agencies approached the Soviet Union. The realization that they had been so thoroughly deceived led to a period of soul-searching and reform within these agencies. There was a recognition of the need for more rigorous verification of intelligence and a greater understanding of the psychological games that could be played in the arena of espionage. However, the legacy of Operation Trust extends beyond the immediate reforms it prompted. It stands as a testament to the power of deception and manipulation in international relations, a reminder of how vulnerable even the most powerful nations can be to cleverly crafted illusions. And it's in this legacy that we find one of the most compelling aspects of Operation Trust: its enduring impact on the world of espionage and international diplomacy, an impact that continues to shape how nations interact with each other to this day. But what's often overlooked in discussions of Operation Trust is the human element. The operation involved countless individuals, each with their own motivations and fears. From the KGB agents who risked everything to maintain the illusion, to the Western intelligence officers who found themselves entangled in the web of deceit, every player in this drama was driven by a complex mix of patriotism, ideology, and personal ambition. Understanding these human dynamics is crucial to grasping the full complexity of Operation Trust. It was not just a clever espionage operation. It was a reflection of the deeper psychological and ideological currents that were shaping the world in the aftermath of World War I. As we delve deeper into the story of Operation Trust, it becomes clear that the truth behind this operation is far more nuanced and multifaceted than initially meets the eye. The intricacies of Operation Trust also highlight the challenge of distinguishing between fact and fiction in the world of espionage. In an arena where deception is a primary tool, the truth can become obscured, making it difficult for historians and analysts to reconstruct events with absolute certainty. This challenge is compounded by the secretive nature of intelligence work, where records are often classified or destroyed, leaving behind only fragments of information. Despite these challenges, the story of Operation Trust serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of skepticism and rigorous analysis in the pursuit of truth, especially in the complex and often opaque world of international espionage. As we continue to unravel the mysteries of Operation Trust, we are reminded that, even decades later, the lessons it teaches about deception, manipulation, and the human condition remain as relevant as ever. The intricate web of deceptions spun by the KGB during Operation Trust was so sophisticated that it even managed to infiltrate the highest echelons of Western intelligence agencies, including the CIA and MI6. One of the most striking examples of this infiltration is the case of Kim Philby, a British intelligence officer who defected to the Soviet Union in 1963. Philby, who was a member of the notorious Cambridge Five, had been working for the KGB since the 1930s, and his position within MI6 gave him unparalleled access to sensitive information about Western intelligence operations. But what's even more astonishing is that Philby's betrayal was not an isolated incident. There were other moles within Western intelligence agencies, and the KGB's strategy of infiltration and manipulation was far more extensive than initially thought. As we delve deeper into the world of Operation Trust, we begin to uncover a complex network of agents, double agents, and triple agents, all working to further the interests of the Soviet Union. The KGB's use of disinformation and propaganda was a key component of this operation, and they were able to spread false information and misleading rumors with ease. This had a profound impact on the way Western intelligence agencies perceived the Soviet Union, and it often led to incorrect assumptions and miscalculations. But that wasn't the only way the KGB was able to manipulate Western intelligence. They also used their agents to feed false information to their enemies, creating a sense of confusion and mistrust that would ultimately work to the Soviet Union's advantage. The question remains, how many of these moles were actually caught, and how many remained hidden, pulling the strings from within? The KGB's use of psychological manipulation was another crucial aspect of Operation Trust. They understood that the key to successful infiltration was not just about gathering information, but also about influencing the people who had access to that information. They used a variety of tactics, including blackmail, bribery, and emotional manipulation, to recruit agents and get them to do their bidding. One of the most famous examples of this is the case of Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer who was recruited by the KGB in the 1980s. Ames was motivated by a combination of financial and ideological factors, and he went on to betray his country by revealing the identities of numerous CIA agents working in the Soviet Union. But what's fascinating is that Ames's betrayal was not just about the money. He was also driven by a deep-seated resentment towards the CIA, which he felt had mistreated him. This raises an important question: how many other Western intelligence officers were vulnerable to this type of manipulation, and what were the long-term consequences of the KGB's psychological warfare? As we explore the inner workings of Operation Trust, we begin to realize that the KGB's strategy was not just about infiltrating Western intelligence agencies, but also about creating a sense of paranoia and mistrust within those organizations. By spreading false information and rumors, they were able to create an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust where no one knew who to trust. This had a profound impact on the way Western intelligence agencies operated, and it often led to a breakdown in communication and cooperation between different agencies. But that wasn't the strangest part. The KGB's strategy also involved creating fake intelligence agencies, complete with their own agents and operations. This was a bold move, and it shows just how far the KGB was willing to go to achieve their goals. The question now becomes, how did the West eventually discover the extent of the KGB's infiltration, and what were the consequences of this discovery? The answer to this question lies in the story of Oleg Penkovsky, a Soviet military intelligence officer who defected to the West in the 1960s. Penkovsky was a key figure in the discovery of the KGB's infiltration of Western intelligence agencies, and his testimony provided valuable insights into the inner workings of Operation Trust. Through Penkovsky's revelations, Western intelligence agencies were finally able to understand the extent of the KGB's infiltration and manipulation, and they were able to take steps to counter it. But what's remarkable is that Penkovsky's defection was not just about revealing the truth, it was also about revenge. Penkovsky had been a loyal servant of the Soviet Union, but he had become disillusioned with the regime and its ideology. His decision to defect was motivated by a desire to expose the truth about the Soviet Union's intelligence operations and to bring an end to the KGB's reign of terror. This pivotal moment marked a turning point in the history of Operation Trust, as it finally allowed Western intelligence agencies to gain the upper hand in the cat-and-mouse game of espionage. The implications of Penkovsky's defection were far-reaching, and they had a profound impact on the way Western intelligence agencies operated. For the first time, they had a clear understanding of the KGB's strategy and tactics, and they were able to take steps to counter them. This included implementing new security protocols, such as polygraph testing and background checks, to prevent further infiltration. It also involved a major overhaul of their recruitment and training programs to ensure that they were attracting the right kind of people and giving them the skills they needed to succeed. But even with these new measures in place, the legacy of Operation Trust continued to haunt Western intelligence agencies. The question of how many moles were still hidden, waiting to strike, remained a constant concern, and the atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that the KGB had created continued to linger. As we move forward, we will explore the long-term consequences of Operation Trust and examine the ways in which it continues to shape the world of international espionage today. The story of Operation Trust is a complex and fascinating one, full of twists and turns that continue to surprise and intrigue us. As we delve deeper into the world of espionage and counter-espionage, we begin to realize that nothing is ever as it seems, and that the truth is often hidden behind a veil of deception and misinformation. But one thing is clear: the KGB's Operation Trust was a masterpiece of espionage, a complex and sophisticated operation that was designed to manipulate and deceive. And even though it was eventually uncovered, its legacy continues to shape the world of international espionage, serving as a powerful reminder of the importance of skepticism and rigorous analysis in the pursuit of truth. But what's even more intriguing is that there are still many unanswered questions surrounding Operation Trust, questions about the true extent of the KGB's infiltration and the ways in which they were able to manipulate Western intelligence agencies. As we continue to explore this complex and fascinating topic, we may yet uncover even more surprising revelations and gain a deeper understanding of the intricate web of espionage and counter-espionage that continues to shape our world today. As we move closer to the truth, we begin to realize that the story of Operation Trust is not just about the KGB's infiltration of Western intelligence agencies, it's also about the people who were involved and the motivations that drove them. We see a complex cast of characters, each with their own unique story and motivations. There are the spies and the counter-spies, the defectors and the moles, each playing their own role in the grand game of espionage. And at the heart of it all is the KGB, a powerful and ruthless organization that was willing to do whatever it took to achieve its goals. But what's fascinating is that the KGB's strategy was not just about winning the game of espionage, it was also about shaping the narrative and creating a sense of reality that was favorable to the Soviet Union. This was a bold move, and it shows just how far the KGB was willing to go to achieve their objectives. The question now becomes, how did the West eventually respond to this challenge, and what were the consequences of their response? The answer to this question lies in the story of the Cold War and the ways in which the West responded to the Soviet Union's aggressive strategy. We see a complex and multifaceted response involving everything from espionage and counter-espionage to diplomacy and propaganda. The West was determined to counter the Soviet Union's influence and to promote their own values and interests. But what's remarkable is that this response was not just about winning the Cold War, it was also about shaping the future and creating a world that was more just and equitable. The story of Operation Trust is a powerful reminder of the importance of this struggle and the ways in which it continues to shape our world today. As we move forward, we will explore the long-term consequences of Operation Trust and examine the ways in which it continues to influence the world of international espionage. But for now, we are left with a sense of awe and wonder at the complexity and sophistication of the KGB's operation, and a deep appreciation for the bravery and cunning of those who worked to uncover the truth. To understand how an entire intelligence apparatus could be duped for over half a decade, one must look at the brilliant, sinister mechanics devised by Artur Arduzov, the head of the GPU's counterintelligence department. Artuzov recognized a fundamental law of human psychology. Human beings, especially intelligence officers, are far more likely to believe a lie if it confirms what they desperately want to believe. In the early 1920s, European governments and exiled Tsarist elites were consumed by a single, desperate hope that the Bolshevik regime was fragile, ideologically divided, and on the verge of collapsing from within. Artuzov gave them exact proof of that fantasy, to make the fake resistance group known as the Monarchist Union of Central Russia appear authentic. Artuzov understood a fundamental law of intelligence. A lie is only convincing if it is 90% true. To head the Monarchist Union of Central Russia, the OGPU recruited Alexander Yakashev, a former official in the Tsarist Ministry of Communications who was now working in the Soviet bureaucracy. Yakashev was cultured, articulate, and possessed genuine aristocratic credentials. What Western intelligence did not know was that Yakashev had been arrested, compromised, and systematically turned by the secret police months earlier. In 1922, Yakashev was granted official permission by Soviet authorities to travel abroad on government commercial business. His real destination was Tallinn, Estonia, then a primary hub for anti-Soviet intrigue and foreign espionage. There, he established contact with representatives of exile military organizations and Western intelligence officers. He brought with him a compelling, impeccably framed narrative. Inside Russia, a powerful underground network of Tsarist veterans, high-ranking military officers, and disillusioned Soviet bureaucrats was quietly preparing to overthrow the Bolshevik regime from within. This shadow organization claimed to call itself the Monarchist Union of Central Russia. To the desperate white Russian immigrants living in poverty across Europe, and to the spymasters in London, Warsaw, and Paris, it sounded like the answer to their prayers. Here, allegedly, was a ready-made counter-revolutionary army operating right under the noses of the Kremlin. But every single ledger, every clandestine meeting room, and every high-ranking officer associated with this group was a complete phantom. It was a masterpiece of political theater, conceived and directed by the Soviet secret police, the GPU, under the overall command of Felix Dzerzhinsky, and executed by his brilliant counterintelligence chief, Artur Artuzov. What Yakashev was selling in Tallinn was the opening act of an enterprise codenamed Operation Trust. The brilliant, counterintuitive stroke of Artuzov's plan was not to create an aggressive, bloodthirsty anti-Bolshevik front, but a patient one. Artuzov understood the psychology of professional intelligence officers better than they understood themselves. He knew that if a pretend resistance movement promised an immediate armed uprising, Western intelligence would be suspicious. But if the resistance warned its foreign partners to hold back, to refrain from premature terrorist attacks, and to wait until the underground network was fully matured, it would command total credibility. That subtle shift in narrative was the psychological hook. The GPU told foreign powers exactly what cautious intelligence directors wanted to hear. Do not launch reckless raids, do not fund uncoordinated sabotage, and above all, do not act until we give the word. By convincing Western agencies to funnel all their operations through this single, controlled channel, the Bolsheviks effectively gained a veto over all anti-Soviet intelligence operations across Europe. But that control was only the beginning of what the GPU intended to extract. To make the illusion convincing, the Soviet state police had to commit to a dangerous double game. Artuzov realized that to keep the British, French, and Polish secret services hooked, the trust had to deliver genuine, high-grade intelligence. Low-level fabrications would be exposed by analytical departments in London or Warsaw within months. And so, with the explicit authorization of the Soviet leadership, the GPU began feeding real economic data, diplomatic communications, and military intelligence to foreign powers. This created a staggering operational paradox inside Moscow. The secret police were actively leaking actual state secrets to enemy intelligence agencies in order to maintain the integrity of their cover story. Soviet border guards were ordered to facilitate the illegal crossing of foreign agents, providing them with authentic Soviet identity papers and escorting them to real safe houses in Moscow and Leningrad. To any outside observer, these agents were penetrating deep into the heart of the Red State. In reality, every step they took was mapped out, recorded, and evaluated by GPU handlers sitting in offices just streets away. Yet the strategy carried enormous risk. If a foreign intelligence service managed to cross-reference this real data with an independent source, or if a single GPU officer defected, the entire apparatus would collapse, exposing the Soviet Union's total vulnerability. The Kremlin was gambling its security on the assumption that Western agencies were too blind or too arrogant to question a miracle. And for years, that gamble paid off completely. Polish intelligence, which shared a vast and unstable border with the Soviet Union, surrendered almost its entire Eastern intelligence architecture to the trust. The British Secret Intelligence Service, operating through its Baltic stations, began relying on trust networks as its primary source of information regarding Red Army troop deployments and Kremlin palace intrigue. The Western powers were not merely paying for this intelligence with political goodwill, they were funding the operation out of their own intelligence budgets. British and Polish money was quietly laundered through Western bank accounts and transferred directly into the operational funds of the GPU. The Soviet counterintelligence service was literally forcing Western taxpayers to pay for their own manipulation. As the money and credibility poured in, the GPU set its sights on a far more ambitious objective than simple intelligence gathering. Dzerzhinsky and Artuzov realized that the trust could be used as a strategic weapon to neutralize the most dangerous enemies of the Soviet state residing in exile. Chief among these was Boris Savinkov, a legendary revolutionary, former deputy minister of war in the provisional government, and one of the most lethal anti-Bolshevik conspirators alive. Savinkov had spent years organizing armed incursions and assassination attempts against Soviet officials from his exile in Paris and Poland. He was a veteran terrorist, deeply paranoid, and obsessively cautious. The GPU knew that as long as Savinkov remained outside Soviet borders, he represented an unpredictable and dangerous threat. To eliminate him, the trust initiated a multi-year psychological operation designed to exploit his supreme vanity and his desperate desire to lead a Russian liberation movement. Through carefully orchestrated communications, trust couriers convinced Savinkov that his personal presence was required inside Russia to unite the various factions of the monarchist and military underground. Savinkov hesitated for months, demanding proof of the network's existence and strength. In response, the GPU arranged for Savinkov's trusted lieutenants to be smuggled into the Soviet Union, taken on guided tours of secret military cells, and introduced to charismatic high-ranking Red Army officers who claimed to be secretly loyal to the underground cause. Every officer they met was an actor or a turned operative working for Artuzov. The lieutenants returned to Paris, convinced that Russia was on the verge of a massive internal explosion. In August 1924, Savinkov, now fully convinced of the impending revolution, began to mobilize his resources, planning a grand return to Russia to lead the charge against the Bolsheviks. But as he worked tirelessly, unbeknownst to him, every move he made was being monitored and manipulated by Artuzov's operatives. The KGB had successfully created a web of deception so intricate that even the most skeptical of observers couldn't help but be drawn in. Meanwhile, back in Moscow, Artuzov was receiving glowing reports of the operation's success, with each new piece of information further solidifying the illusion of an imminent uprising. But that wasn't the only front on which Operation Trust was advancing. The Soviet Union was also making overtures to the British, attempting to establish a veneer of legitimacy for their fabricated anti-Bolshevik movement. As the months passed, the British government found itself increasingly entangled in the web of deceit, with high-ranking officials beginning to take notice of the supposed dissident movement within the Soviet Union. This development raised the stakes significantly, as the potential for a major diplomatic incident loomed large. But just as it seemed that Operation Trust was reaching its zenith, a complication arose in the form of a small group of skeptics within British intelligence, who began to question the authenticity of the information being fed to them. Led by a seasoned operative named Sidney Riley, this group started to dig deeper, seeking to uncover the truth behind the mysterious reports emanating from Russia. Their investigation would eventually lead them down a rabbit hole of contradictions and inconsistencies, threatening to upend the entire operation. But for the time being, Artuzov remained one step ahead, feeding the skeptics just enough information to keep them at bay. One of the most intriguing aspects of Operation Trust was the way in which it managed to infiltrate the highest echelons of Western intelligence, with even the most seasoned operatives falling prey to the Soviet Union's cleverly constructed deception. The lieutenants who had been taken on guided tours of secret military cells, for example, had been handpicked for their gullibility, and the charismatic high-ranking Red Army officers they met had been coached to perfection. Every detail, no matter how small, had been meticulously planned and executed, leaving no room for doubt. But as the operation continued to unfold, it became clear that the Soviet Union's ultimate goal was not simply to deceive Western intelligence, but to manipulate it, using the fabricated anti-Bolshevik movement as a tool to further their own interests. And so, the question remained, what exactly did the Soviet Union hope to achieve through this elaborate ruse? The answer, much like the operation itself, was complex and multifaceted. As the investigation by Riley and his team continued, they began to uncover evidence of a much larger conspiracy, one that reached far beyond the confines of Operation Trust. It appeared that the Soviet Union had been engaging in a systematic campaign of disinformation, using their agents and operatives to spread false information and manipulate public opinion. This realization raised the stakes significantly, as it became clear that the Soviet Union's ultimate goal was not simply to deceive Western intelligence, but to undermine the very foundations of democracy. But just as it seemed that the truth was finally beginning to emerge, a new complication arose in the form of a mysterious figure, known only by his codename, who seemed to be working behind the scenes to further the interests of the Soviet Union. His true identity and motivations remained unknown, adding another layer of complexity to an already tangled web of intrigue. The more Riley and his team learned, the more they realized that Operation Trust was just the tip of the iceberg, a small part of a much larger and more complex operation. The Soviet Union had been engaged in a decades-long campaign of deception and manipulation, using every tool at their disposal to further their interests and undermine those of their enemies. And at the heart of it all was Arduzov, the mastermind behind Operation Trust, who had successfully created a web of deceit so intricate that it had ensnared even the most seasoned operatives. But as the investigation continued, it became clear that Arduzov was not working alone, and that there were others, higher up in the Soviet hierarchy, who were pulling the strings. The question on everyone's mind was, who were these shadowy figures, and what was their ultimate goal? The answer, much like the operation itself, remained shrouded in mystery, waiting to be uncovered. As the months turned into years, the complexity of Operation Trust continued to unfold, revealing a tangled web of deceit and manipulation that reached to the highest echelons of power. The Soviet Union's use of disinformation and propaganda had been so effective that even the most skeptical of observers had been caught off guard, and it wasn't until the operation had run its course that the true extent of the deception became clear. But by then, the damage had already been done, and the Soviet Union had achieved its goal of manipulating Western intelligence and undermining the foundations of democracy. The legacy of Operation Trust would be felt for decades to come, serving as a stark reminder of the power of deception and manipulation in the world of espionage. And yet, despite the passage of time, there remain many unanswered questions, leaving one to wonder. What other secrets lie hidden, waiting to be uncovered? But that wasn't the strangest part, for as the investigation continued, it became clear that the Soviet Union's use of deception and manipulation was not limited to Operation Trust, but was instead a key component of their overall strategy, one that would continue to evolve and adapt in the years to come. The story of Operation Trust serves as a fascinating case study in the art of deception, highlighting the ways in which a well-crafted lie can be used to manipulate even the most skeptical of observers. The Soviet Union's use of disinformation and propaganda was so effective that it managed to convince even the most seasoned operatives that a fictitious anti-Bolshevik movement was real, and that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. But as the operation continued to unfold, it became clear that the Soviet Union's ultimate goal was not simply to deceive Western intelligence, but to use the fabricated movement as a tool to further their own interests. The question on everyone's mind was, how far did the deception go, and what other secrets lay hidden beneath the surface? The answer, much like the operation itself, remained complex and multifaceted, waiting to be uncovered by those brave enough to dig deeper. As the investigation into Operation Trust continued, it became clear that the Soviet Union's use of deception and manipulation was not limited to the world of espionage, but was instead a key component of their overall strategy. The Soviet Union had been engaged in a systematic campaign of disinformation, using their agents and operatives to spread false information and manipulate public opinion. This realization raised the stakes significantly, as it became clear that the Soviet Union's ultimate goal was not simply to deceive Western intelligence, but to undermine the very foundations of democracy. But just as it seemed that the truth was finally beginning to emerge, a new complication arose in the form of a mysterious document known only as the Trust Protocol, which seemed to hold the key to unlocking the secrets of the operation. The document, which had been circulating in secret, appeared to be a blueprint for the operation, outlining the Soviet Union's plan to use deception and manipulation to further their interests. But as investigators delved deeper, they realized that the document was not what it seemed, and that its true purpose remained shrouded in mystery. The Trust Protocol, as it came to be known, was a mysterious document that seemed to hold the key to unlocking the secrets of Operation Trust. The document, which had been circulating in secret, appeared to be a blueprint for the operation, outlining the Soviet Union's plan to use deception and manipulation to further their interests. But as investigators delved deeper, they realized that the document was not what it seemed, and that its true purpose remained shrouded in mystery. The protocol seemed to be a cleverly constructed puzzle, with each piece fitting together to form a complex picture of deception and manipulation. But as the investigation continued, it became clear that the protocol was just one part of a much larger puzzle, and that the true extent of the Soviet Union's deception remained to be seen. The question on everyone's mind was, what other secrets lay hidden, waiting to be uncovered? The answer, much like the operation itself, remained complex and multifaceted, waiting to be uncovered by those brave enough to dig deeper. The investigation into Operation Trust was a complex and multifaceted one, with each new revelation raising more questions than answers. The Soviet Union's use of deception and manipulation had been so effective that even the most seasoned operatives had been caught off guard, and it wasn't until the operation had run its course that the true extent of the deception became clear. But as the investigation continued, it became clear that the Soviet Union's ultimate goal was not simply to deceive Western intelligence, but to use the fabricated anti-Bolshevik movement as a tool to further their own interests. The question on everyone's mind was, how far did the deception go, and what other secrets lay hidden beneath the surface? The answer, much like the operation itself, remained complex and multifaceted, waiting to be uncovered by those brave enough to dig deeper. And so, the investigation continued, with each new revelation shedding more light on the intricate web of deceit and manipulation that had been spun by the Soviet Union. As the investigation into Operation Trust drew to a close, it became clear that the Soviet Union's use of deception and manipulation had been far more extensive than anyone could have imagined. The operation had been a masterpiece of espionage, with each piece fitting together to form a complex picture of deception and manipulation. But as the truth finally began to emerge, it became clear that the Soviet Union's ultimate goal had not been to deceive Western intelligence, but to use the fabricated anti-Bolshevik movement as a tool to further their own interests. The question on everyone's mind was, what other secrets lay hidden, waiting to be uncovered? The answer, much like the operation itself, remained complex and multifaceted, waiting to be uncovered by those brave enough to dig deeper. And so, the legacy of Operation Trust serves as a stark reminder of the power of deception and manipulation in the world of espionage, a reminder that even the most seasoned operatives can be caught off guard by a well-crafted lie. But that wasn't the strangest part, for as the investigation continued, it became clear that the Soviet Union's use of deception and manipulation was not limited to Operation Trust, but was instead a key component of their overall strategy, one that would continue to evolve and adapt in the years to come. To understand how this strategy matured, one has to look back at the original architects of Operation Trust. Felix Dzerzhinsky, the ruthless founder of the Soviet secret police, and his brilliant master of counterintelligence, Artur Artuzov, realized a fundamental truth early on. They understood that standard repression could suppress dissidents, but it could never neutralize foreign intelligence services. To do that, they needed to control the entire operational environment. They needed to give their enemies an organization so compelling, so seemingly authentic, that foreign agents would stop trying to build their own networks and instead funnel all their resources into a Trojan horse designed and monitored by Moscow. That Trojan horse was given a grand, convincing name: the Monarchist Union of Central Russia. To the outside world, and to the desperate white Russian immigrants living in exile across Paris, Berlin, and Warsaw, it was known simply as the Trust. On paper, it was a massive, highly disciplined underground resistance movement operating inside the Soviet Union. Its leaders claimed to be former Tsarist officers, high-ranking military commanders, and disaffected Bolshevik officials embedded in the highest echelons of the Soviet state, all quietly preparing for an armed coup to dismantle the communist regime from within. In reality, the Trust was entirely conceived, orchestrated, and operated by the KRO, the counterintelligence department of the GPU, the Soviet secret police. To make this grand lie believable, Artur Artuzov needed a face for the organization, someone who possessed flawless aristocratic credentials and genuine anti-Bolshevik credibility. He found his man in Alexander Yakashev. Yakashev was a former high-ranking official in the Imperial Russian Ministry of Transport, who was currently working for the Soviet Commissariat of Foreign Trade. He was respected, articulate, and frequented the corridors of Soviet power. In late 1921, the Cheka arrested Yakashev on suspicion of counter-revolutionary sympathies. But instead of executing him, Artuzov offered him a choice: rot in a cell or play the leading role in the greatest intelligence illusion of the 20th century. Yakashev broke, agreed to cooperate, and was sent abroad as a diplomatic trade envoy. His real assignment was to make contact with white Russian exile networks and convince them that a powerful, well-funded resistance movement was waiting for their command inside Soviet Russia. When Yakashev made contact with emigre leaders in Berlin and Reval, the reaction was explosive. For years, the anti-Bolshevik movement had been fractured, impoverished, and desperate for a sign that their homeland was ready to rise up. Here was a senior bureaucrat, speaking their language, presenting detailed maps, organizational charts, and intelligence reports detailing a vast network of anti-Soviet cells ready to strike. But Yakashev delivered one crucial caveat, a condition that would become the core operational rule of the Trust. The foreign exiles and Western intelligence services must not attempt any direct military incursions, terrorist attacks, or independent espionage operations inside Soviet territory. Any premature action, Yakashev warned, would force the Cheka to crack down and destroy the fragile underground before the coup was ready. Western intelligence agencies were instantly hooked. By promising a massive, effortless victory in the future, the Trust persuaded the West to suspend its active subversion in the present. Yet, Artuzov knew that a lie of this magnitude could not survive on promise alone.